They walked the same earth as our ancestors, hunted across ancient landscapes, mastered stone and fire, and survived in worlds we would barely recognize. Yet somewhere along the path of human evolution, entire human species disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of bone, traces of DNA, and mysteries buried for thousands of years. Who were these forgotten humans, and why did they vanish while our species survived? If you enjoy uncovering the lost chapters of human history, like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we explore the strange human species that time erased. The cave is almost completely dark when the first fragment appears. It is not a skull, not a complete skeleton, not even enough bone to immediately reveal the shape of the person who once carried it. It is only a small piece of an ancient human body buried in cold sediment for tens of thousands of years. Yet from material this slight, an entire lost population can begin to emerge. A tooth, a fingertip bone, a fragment of jaw, a few molecules of surviving DNA, sometimes that is all that remains between an extinct kind of human and total oblivion. For most of history, no one knew these people had ever existed. They left no written names, no monuments carved with their identities, and no surviving descendants who remembered them as a separate people. Time did not merely defeat them, it nearly erased the evidence that they had ever occupied the earth at all. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story hidden inside these fragments is larger than the discovery of one extinct species. It changes the picture of humanity itself. The familiar image of human evolution as a simple procession with one primitive ancestor gradually turning into modern Homo sapiens is deeply misleading. For much of prehistory, humanity is not one thing. It is a crowded family of populations branching, separating, adapting, meeting again, and sometimes disappearing. At different moments, several kinds of humans walk the planet simultaneously, each carrying its own evolutionary history. Some become famous, like the Neanderthals. Others remain almost invisible, known from only a handful of bones. Stranger still, some are discovered first, not through fossils at all, but through their DNA. One of the most remarkable examples begins in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. Archaeologists working there recover tiny human remains from sediments that preserve evidence of repeated occupation across deep time. Among the finds is a small finger bone belonging to a young individual. Morphologically, there is little about such a fragment that could reveal an entirely distinct human population. But genetic analysis transforms the discovery. DNA extracted from the bone does not belong to a modern human, and it is not simply Neanderthal either. It represents another ancient lineage closely related to Neanderthals, but genetically distinct. A population that science had not known existed suddenly enters the human story. They become known as Denisovans after the cave where that first decisive genetic evidence is identified. The name is modern, convenient, and almost certainly unrelated to anything these people would have called themselves. What they looked like remains partly uncertain. Their fossil record is still extremely sparse compared with that of Neanderthals or modern humans. A few teeth, jaw, material bone fragments, and genetically identified remains provide clues, while other fossils are debated as possible Denisovan relatives. Yet their genetic footprint suggests something extraordinary. Denisovan populations were not confined to one cold Siberian cave. Their ancestry appears in living people thousands of kilometers away, particularly among populations in parts of Oceania and Asia. The bodies mostly vanished, but pieces of their genomes survived. That contradiction lies at the heart of the mystery. A human population can disappear as a recognizable physical group and still remain biologically present. Extinction in human evolution does not always mean that every individual died without descendants. Sometimes a population may be absorbed, fragmented, or genetically diluted into other expanding groups. Its identity disappears while some of its genes continue moving through history. The archaeological record becomes silent, yet the inheritance remains inside living bodies. The discovery also exposes how incomplete the fossil record really is. Fossilization is rare. Human remains are especially vulnerable to decay, erosion, scavenging soil chemistry, geological disturbance, and simple chance. A population might exist for tens of thousands of years and leave behind only a tiny collection of bones that happen to survive in conditions favorable enough for preservation. Even when fossils remain, they may lie beneath modern cities, deep cave deposits, forests, deserts, coastlines now submerged beneath the sea, or regions where archaeological research has barely begun. What survives in the record suggests that human diversity was probably greater than the surviving fossils alone can show. This is why ancient DNA has changed the field so dramatically. Bones once considered too fragmentary to identify can sometimes reveal genetic relationships with extraordinary precision. Sediments themselves may preserve traces of ancient human DNA, even when no visible human bone is present. In some caves, researchers can detect the presence of Neanderthals or Denisovans from genetic material left behind in layers of earth. The people are gone. Their skeletons may be gone, yet molecular traces remain trapped in the ground. But DNA is not a perfect time machine. Preservation depends heavily on temperature, age, moisture, and environmental conditions. Cold regions are much more favorable than tropical environments, meaning entire parts of human evolutionary history remain genetically underrepresented. Africa, where the deepest chapters of human evolution unfolded, presents particular challenges because heat accelerates DNA degradation. Scientists increasingly detect hints within modern genomes of ancient populations that may have contributed ancestry to later humans, yet identifying exactly who those populations were remains difficult. Scholars still debate how many distinct archaic groups existed, how they were related, and whether some apparent genetic signals represent unknown populations or complicated patterns within populations already known. The uncertainty makes the story stranger rather than weaker. The evidence does not reveal one neatly defined, forgotten species waiting to be rediscovered. It reveals a world in which the boundaries between human groups may have been fluid. Populations separate for immense stretches of time, develop distinctive traits, then meet and exchange genes. Some disappear, some merge, some survive only as fragments inside other people. Standing in the present, surrounded by more than 8 billion members of a single surviving human species, it is easy to assume that this was always the natural condition of humanity. But deep prehistory tells another story. There was a time when a traveller crossing Eurasia might have entered landscapes inhabited by humans whose ancestors had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Their faces may have differed. Their bodies may have been adapted to different climates. Their technologies may have developed along separate paths. Yet they were close enough, at least in some cases, to have children together. The human world was once plural. And to understand how strange that world truly was, the isolated bones and genetic fragments must be placed back into the vast Ice Age landscape from which they came, a landscape where Homo sapiens was only one branch among many. The Ice Age world does not belong to a single humanity. Across a vast belt of land stretching from Western Europe to the mountains of Central Asia, from the forests of Southeast Asia to the open landscapes of Africa, different human populations live at the same time, often separated by immense distances, but sometimes close enough to cross paths. Some are robust and cold adapted. Others are smaller, perhaps shaped by island isolation. Some leave stone tools that resemble those of neighbouring groups, while others seem to follow technological traditions that developed locally over long periods. To modernize, all of them belong somewhere within the human family. To each other, however, they may have appeared as unfamiliar forms of people whose ancestors had been separated for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. The world Homo sapiens enters is already inhabited. Neanderthals occupy much of Europe and parts of Western and Central Asia for an extraordinary span of time. Their bodies reflect survival in demanding environments. They tend to have broad torsos, powerful limbs and skulls that differ noticeably from those of modern humans. Their large nasal regions may have played some role in conditioning cold, dry air, although the exact function remains debated. They hunt large animals, use fire, manufacture complex stone tools, exploit caves and open landscapes, and survive repeated climatic swings that transform forests into steppe and steppe back into woodland. Far from being evolutionary failures waiting to disappear, Neanderthals endure through conditions that repeatedly reshape Eurasia. Farther east, Denisovan populations occupy a territory that may have been enormous. Their genetic legacy points toward a complex distribution across Asia, but their physical remains remain maddeningly scarce. This mismatch between genetic reach and fossil visibility is one of the most remarkable features of the ancient human record. Denisovan ancestry appears in people far from Siberia, including populations in New Guinea, parts of island Southeast Asia, and elsewhere in Asia. This implies repeated contact between Denisovan-related groups and populations ancestral to later modern humans. Yet science still lacks a complete Denisovan skeleton. What survives is enough to prove their existence, but not enough to reconstruct them with confidence. Southeast Asia adds an even stranger layer. On the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncover remains belonging to Homo floresiensis, a small-bodied human relative with a surprisingly small brain. The species becomes famous partly because of its stature, but the deeper importance lies in what it reveals about human evolution and isolation. Flores has no simple land bridge to mainland Asia, even when sea levels are lower, meaning the ancestors of these humans or their relatives must somehow have crossed water. How deliberately they did so remains uncertain. Once established on the island, their lineage follows an evolutionary path, unlike that of humans living on the continents. On Luzon in the Philippines, another set of fragmentary remains is assigned to Homo luzonensis. Teeth and small bones display a mixture of traits that does not fit neatly into one familiar species. Some features appear relatively recent, while others seem unexpectedly primitive. The evidence remains incomplete, and the evolutionary ancestry of this population is still debated. Yet even the uncertainty matters. It shows that islands across Southeast Asia may once have held human populations whose histories developed in partial isolation and whose diversity is only beginning to be recognized. This is not a neat world arranged into clearly separated species territories. Climate constantly rearranges the map. Glaciers expand and retreat. Rainfall zones shift. Deserts grow, shrink, and sometimes become greener. Coastlines move dramatically as enormous quantities of water become locked in continental ice. During colder periods, sea levels can fall by more than 100 meters, exposing broad plains where shallow seas exist today. Animals follow changing vegetation, and humans follow animals' water, raw materials, and habitable corridors. Populations that have been separated may suddenly find routes opening between them. Others become trapped behind new environmental barriers. Africa is even more important and perhaps even harder to summarize. Homo sapiens emerges there, but the process does not appear to occur as a simple transformation inside one small isolated population. Fossils from different regions show combinations of ancient and more modern traits. Genetic evidence indicates deep population structure within Africa, with groups separating, reconnecting, and exchanging ancestry over long periods. Some researchers describe this as a braided stream rather than a single evolutionary line. No single metaphor captures the full complexity, but the key idea is clear. Modern humanity emerges from a continent populated by diverse and interacting groups, not from a perfectly uniform ancestral population. The traditional evolutionary tree therefore begins to look inadequate. Trees are useful because they represent branching ancestry, but human populations do not always remain separated after branching. They can meet again. Genes can move between them. The branches reconnect. Neanderthals and modern humans interbreed. Denisovans and modern humans interbreed. Denisovan and Neanderthal populations also interbreed. One remarkable individual discovered through DNA from Denisova Cave had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She's not evidence of a distant genetic trace after countless generations. She's the direct child of parents belonging to two deeply separated ancient populations. That single young person changes the emotional scale of the subject. Evolutionary diagrams often reduce entire populations to lines diverging across thousands of generations. But somewhere in Ice Age Eurasia, those lines become living people who meet. Individuals from different populations travel through overlapping landscapes, encounter one another, and sometimes form reproductive relationships. Whether such encounters are common, rare, peaceful, violent, or socially complex cannot usually be recovered. The genome records contact but not the circumstances. Their environments are harsh enough to keep populations relatively small and scattered. Hunter-gatherer groups often depend on detailed local knowledge. The seasonal movement of animals, the location of stone suitable for tools, the behavior of rivers' shelter during severe winters, edible plants, coastlines and routes through mountains. A population can survive for thousands of years while remaining numerically tiny compared with later agricultural societies. That small population size has enormous consequences. Local groups can disappear through disease, food shortages, failed reproduction, environmental disaster, or simple demographic bad luck. A few deaths at the wrong moment may matter far more than they would in a large society. At the same time, survival requires remarkable adaptability. Ancient humans occupy environments ranging from cold, northern latitudes to tropical islands, high plateaus, grasslands, forests, and coastal regions. Denisovan ancestry associated with adaptation to high altitudes survives in modern Tibetan populations, demonstrating that useful biological adaptations developed in ancient groups could later enter Homo sapiens through interbreeding. The extinct population disappears as a recognizable people, yet one part of its biological solution to a difficult environment survives. This makes the idea of a superior species replacing inferior ones far too simple. Evolution does not operate as a tournament in which the most advanced contestant inevitably wins. Population size, geography, fertility, disease, environmental change, cultural networks, chance, and interbreeding all matter. Some groups may vanish even though they are well adapted to their own world. Others may survive because they expand rapidly enough to absorb neighboring populations. Scholars still debate the relative importance of these forces in the disappearance of archaic humans. By the time Homo sapiens begins expanding more widely beyond Africa, the human world is therefore already ancient, crowded, and complicated. The newcomers are not walking into empty wilderness. They are entering territories shaped by other humans who know these landscapes hunt. The same animals use many of the same raw materials and possess their own histories stretching back far beyond living memory. Some of those populations will soon vanish from the archaeological record. But before disappearance comes contact, and before contact comes the long evolutionary separation that made these humans so distinctive in the first place. Long before these ancient populations meet face to face, their ancestors are already being pulled apart by geography. Human evolution does not proceed in one place under one set of conditions. It unfolds across landscapes that repeatedly open and close like gates. Mountain ranges divide migration routes. Expanding deserts isolate regions that had once been connected. Rivers shift. Forests retreat. Grasslands spread across former woodland, then disappear again as rainfall patterns change. Ice sheets advance into the north while lower sea levels expose plains that will later vanish beneath the ocean. Each environmental change alters not only where humans can live, but also which groups can reach one another. Over thousands of generations, isolation begins to leave biological consequences. One of the deepest divisions in Eurasian human history separates the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans from the populations that eventually lead toward modern Homo sapiens. Genetic estimates vary, and the evidence remains incomplete, but these lineages appear to diverge hundreds of thousands of years before their later descendants meet again. That length of separation is difficult to imagine on a human scale. Entire climatic cycles pass, animal communities change, technologies develop and disappear. Local populations grow fragment and sometimes vanish. Yet somewhere inside this vast span of time, groups descended from a shared ancestral population become increasingly distinct. Some of the fossils that may illuminate this period are frustratingly difficult to classify. Middle Pleistocene humans possess combinations of traits that do not fit neatly into later categories. Fossils once placed broadly into Homo heidelbergensis, for example, have been interpreted in different ways by different researchers. Some may be closer to Neanderthal ancestry, others to lineages connected with modern humans, and still others may represent regional populations whose precise relationships remain uncertain. Taxonomy gives these remains names, but names can create an illusion of certainty that the fossils themselves do not always provide. Scholars still debate how many species should be recognized and where boundaries between evolving populations should be drawn. The problem becomes clearer when evolution is viewed not as a row of finished species, but as a sequence of changing populations. A group separated by distance does not suddenly become a new species at one identifiable moment. Differences accumulate gradually. Certain facial shapes become more common. Body proportions shift in response to climate and inherited variation. Genetic mutations spread through small populations, sometimes because they provide an advantage, sometimes simply through chance. Cultural habits may also diverge. After enough time, populations can become recognizably different, while still retaining the biological ability to interbreed when they meet again. Neanderthal anatomy provides one of the clearest examples of this long process. Their distinctive facial and skeletal traits do not appear fully formed in the earliest potential ancestors. Instead, features associated with later Neanderthals become increasingly visible across European fossils through time. This has been described as a process of accretion, in which characteristic traits accumulate gradually, rather than appearing all at once. The pattern fits a Europe repeatedly affected by climatic instability, where populations may become isolated in refuges during severe periods, and later expand when conditions improve. These repeated contractions may have had powerful genetic effects. When only a relatively small population survives within a restricted region, genetic drift can become strong. Rare traits may become common by chance, and genetic diversity can decline. Later expansion spreads the resulting characteristics across a larger area. Over many cycles, isolation and reconnection can produce a complicated patchwork of populations related to one another but not genetically identical. Ancient humanity is shaped not only by adaptation, but also by the mathematics of small populations. Denisovan evolution appears even more complex. Genetic evidence suggests that the groups now broadly called Denisovans may themselves have contained deeply separated populations. Modern genomes carry Denisovan-related ancestry that does not appear to derive from one simple interbreeding event with one uniform group. Instead, several episodes of contact may have involved different Denisovan populations across Asia. If this interpretation is correct, the word Denisovan may hide a diversity that future discoveries could eventually divide into multiple regional lineages. Their geographical range alone makes that plausible. Siberia, the Tibetan Plateau, Eastern Asia, and the tropical regions farther south are radically different environments. A population spread across such distances would not remain perfectly homogeneous, particularly during periods when forests, deserts, mountains, and climatic barriers limited movement. One remarkable jaw discovered on the Tibetan Plateau has been linked to Denisovans through protein evidence and later genetic associations from the region, indicating that Denisovan-related humans occupied high-altitude environments, long before modern Tibetan populations developed there. This is a striking reminder that archaic humans were not confined to marginal corners of the world. They adapted to demanding habitats that remain challenging today. Isolation can become even more dramatic on islands. The ancestors of Homo floresiensis somehow reach Flores and then remain cut off from continental populations for a long evolutionary interval. Island ecosystems often produce unusual evolutionary outcomes. Large animals may become smaller when resources are limited, while small animals can sometimes become larger in the absence of familiar predators. Flores itself preserves famous examples of such evolutionary strangeness, including dwarf proboscideans related to elephants. Whether the small body size of Homo floresiensis results largely from island dwarfism, descent from an already small-bodied ancestor, or a combination of factors remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for every anatomical feature. What matters is that isolation creates possibilities. Once gene flow with neighboring populations becomes rare, evolution can move along paths that would otherwise be continually mixed back into a larger population. A small group on an island may preserve ancient traits lost elsewhere, while also developing new adaptations of its own. The same principle applies in less extreme form to populations separated by deserts, mountains, or changing ecological zones. Africa presents a different but equally complicated pattern. Rather than one population remaining isolated until it transforms into Homo sapiens, evidence increasingly points towards several regions connected intermittently over long periods. During wetter phases, areas that now inhospitable may become traversable. During drier periods, populations can become separated. Genetic and fossil evidence together suggest a long history of fragmentation and reconnection. Traits associated with modern humans may therefore appear in different places at different times before becoming combined across broader populations. This helps explain why human origins resist simple maps. There is no single straight road from an ancestral species to the modern human form. There are networks of populations, some connected regularly, others separated for enormous spans of time. Evolutionary change happens within those shifting networks, and beneath all of it lies climate. The Pleistocene is defined by repeated environmental instability on a scale that constantly rearranges opportunities for survival. A valley that supports animals and people for generations can become arid. A coastline rich in resources can move tens of kilometers as sea levels change. A mountain pass can become blocked by ice. A grassland corridor may connect distant populations briefly and then disappear. Humans adapt culturally, but their bodies also carry the long memory of these separations. The unusual proportions, skull shapes, teeth, genetic signatures, and metabolic adaptations seen in extinct populations are not random curiosities. They are traces of landscapes that no longer exist and migrations that can only be partly reconstructed. By the time these lineages finally encounter one another again, they are no longer simply distant versions of the same ancestral population. Hundreds of thousands of years have shaped them differently. Their bones reflect separate histories. Their genomes carry different solutions to survival, and some of the most revealing clues to those differences are written not in what they built, but in the bodies they left behind. The bodies of these vanished humans carry the history of the worlds that shaped them. A skeleton is not simply a framework for movement. Over enough generations, it becomes a record of ancestry, climate, diet, development, injury, and chance. The angle of a limb, the thickness of a bone, the shape of a tooth, or the proportions of a rib cage can preserve clues about how a population lived long after every voice, gesture, and memory has disappeared. This is why a fragment of anatomy can sometimes reveal almost as much as an abandoned tool. The bodies themselves are artifacts, and in extinct humans they often preserve the clearest evidence that evolution had produced forms very different from Homo sapiens. Neanderthals provide the most complete example. Their skeletons are immediately recognizable to specialists, not because they look monstrous or fundamentally non-human, but because a particular suite of traits repeatedly appears together. Their bodies are generally robust, with heavily built bones, broad chests, relatively short lower limbs, and powerful musculature. These proportions may have helped conserve heat in cold environments by reducing surface area relative to body mass, although climate cannot explain every feature. Their skulls are long and low compared with those of modern humans, with prominent brow ridges, large nasal openings, and a projecting mid-face. The back of the skull often carries a distinctive bulge, while the chin is much less pronounced than in Homo sapiens. Their brains are equally interesting. Average Neanderthal cranial capacity is large, in many estimates comparable to or greater than that of modern humans. Brain size by itself does not measure intelligence, and larger brains do not automatically imply greater cognitive ability. Some of the difference may reflect their larger or more robust bodies, and brain organization matters at least as much as volume. Still, the old image of Neanderthals as dull, primitive creatures with tiny brains has no scientific foundation. Their anatomy instead describes a highly successful human adapted to a demanding environment over hundreds of thousands of years. Those adaptations come with costs. Neanderthal skeletons often preserve evidence of serious injuries, fractured ribs, damaged limbs, degenerative joint changes, and other trauma appear repeatedly in the fossil record. Earlier researchers sometimes compared the pattern with modern rodeo riders because of the frequency of injuries to the upper body, though such comparisons are imperfect and should not be taken too literally. Close encounters with large prey may have contributed. Hunting animals such as bison, horses, reindeer, and other large mammals with thrusting weapons could place hunters dangerously near their targets. Yet many individuals survive injuries long enough for substantial healing to occur, which implies some degree of support from others. Even their teeth reveal unusual behavior. Neanderthal front teeth often show heavy wear, and microscopic patterns suggest that teeth may sometimes have been used as tools, perhaps to grip hide fibers or other materials while the hands worked. Small scratches on the front teeth preserve directions consistent with repeated activity near the mouth. Such evidence is indirect, and no single pattern explains every individual, but it brings daily behavior into remarkable focus. A tooth worn tens of thousands of years ago may preserve a trace of how someone held an object while working. Denisovan anatomy is far harder to reconstruct. The problem is not that their bodies were necessarily less distinctive, but that so little survives with secure identification. Some Denisovan-associated teeth are unusually large and robust. The mandible from the Tibetan plateau commonly associated with Denisovans also suggests a strongly built jaw. Yet scientists must resist the temptation to build an entire face from a handful of pieces. Genetic methods can estimate certain biological characteristics, and experimental reconstructions have attempted to infer aspects of Denisovan appearance, but the evidence remains incomplete. A complete skull could transform the field overnight. The smaller-bodied humans of island Southeast Asia present the opposite kind of anatomical surprise. Homo floresiensis stands only a little over a metre tall in the best-known individual, with a brain far smaller than that of modern humans, and even smaller than might be expected for its body size. Yet the species manufactures stone tools and survives on an island environment for a long period. The combination challenges the assumption that human evolution always trends toward larger brains and larger bodies. Evolution has no obligation to move in one direction. When environments, population sizes, and ancestral traits differ, very different outcomes can remain viable. Some parts of the Homo floresiensis skeleton are particularly strange. The wrist preserves features that appear more primitive than those of Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. The feet are relatively long, and elements of the shoulder and pelvis also contribute to a mosaic anatomy. This mixture has fueled debate about ancestry. One possibility is that the species descends from a population related to Homo erectus and becomes smaller after long isolation on Flores. Another is that it retains traits inherited from a more ancient human lineage. Scholars still debate the issue because the fossil sample is limited, and the evolutionary history of early humans in Southeast Asia remains poorly documented. Homo luzonensis complicates the picture further. Its teeth are small in some respect, while certain finger and toe bones display curved or relatively primitive-looking features. The combination does not match any single familiar species. Importantly, a primitive-looking trait does not mean the organism is somehow less evolved. Every surviving population is equally separated in time from its distant ancestors. Ancient traits can persist because there is little evolutionary pressure to change them, while other parts of the body evolve in different directions. These anatomical mosaics undermine the old idea of human evolution as a steady march toward modern form. A population can possess a relatively small brain and sophisticated tool use. Another can have a very large brain yet disappear. A body can retain ancient skeletal features while carrying newly evolved adaptations elsewhere. Evolution works on specific traits under specific conditions, not toward a planned final design. Modern humans themselves are no exception. Homo sapiens has a relatively lightly built skeleton, long limbs in many populations, a high rounded skull, a reduced brow ridge, a small face positioned beneath the brain case, and a pronounced chin. Some of these differences may influence endurance, heat regulation, development, and childbirth. But describing modern anatomy as advanced and archaic anatomy as primitive imposes a hierarchy that evolution does not recognize. Neanderthal bodies are not unfinished versions of ours. They are the result of a separate evolutionary history. The contrast becomes particularly important when these groups begin occupying overlapping regions. A modern human entering Neanderthal territory encounters people whose physiques have been shaped by different pressures for enormous spans of time. Their body proportions, faces, strength, developmental patterns, and perhaps aspects of sensory processing are not identical. Genetic studies suggest that some genes affecting skin immunity, metabolism, and physiology also differ between populations. the exact consequences of many variants remain difficult to reconstruct, yet anatomy also hides unexpected similarities. Neanderthals possess the hyoid bone associated with the tongue and larynx, in a form broadly similar to that of modern humans, and genetic evidence includes a version of the FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language processes in modern humans. Neither clue proves that Neanderthals spoke exactly as Homo sapiens does, but they weaken older claims that were incapable of complex vocal communication. Their archaeological behavior makes simplistic assumptions increasingly difficult to defend. Bones therefore reveal both difference and familiarity. The strange proportions tell of separate evolutionary roads, while healed injuries warn teeth-capable hands, and complex survival strategies repeatedly pull these vanished populations back toward recognizable human experience. They are different enough to remind us that humanity once took multiple physical forms, yet similar enough that the boundaries become uncomfortable to define. And bodies alone cannot reveal the whole person. Muscle leaves only indirect traces. Skin rarely survives. Hair, facial expression, scent, voice, gesture, and most soft tissues disappear almost entirely. A reconstruction in a museum may appear convincing, but much of what gives a living person individuality is missing. To move beyond the skeleton, archaeology must look at what these people touched, carried, burned, hunted, and left on the ground. They're scattered among stone flakes and animal bones. Another part of their lives begins to return. Stone survives where almost everything else disappears. Wood decays, fibers vanish, hides rot away, and the soft materials that probably fill daily life leave only the faintest traces. But a broken piece of flint can remain almost unchanged for tens of thousands of years. This is why the lives of extinct humans often return to us through objects that seem simple at first glance. A sharpened edge, a pile of flakes, a scorched patch of sediment, or the bones of a butchered animal can reveal sequences of behavior that no fossil skeleton can show. These traces do not provide names or stories in the modern sense, but they reveal decisions. Someone selected a stone. Someone understood how it would fracture. Someone carried it, reshaped it, used it, and sometimes repaired it. Archaeology begins to recover not only what these humans looked like, but what they knew. Neanderthal sites offer some of the clearest evidence. Across Europe and Western Asia, their stone industries show repeated patterns of careful planning. One famous method commonly associated with the Middle Paleolithic involves preparing a stone core so that a flake of a desired shape can be removed with a controlled strike. This is not simply smashing rocks until one becomes sharp. The napper must understand how force travels through the stone and must work backward from the intended result. The process can require multiple stages, each one depending on the previous preparation. Variations appear across time and place, reminding archaeologists that Neanderthal technology is not one fixed tradition. Some tools travel surprisingly far from their geological sources. When archaeologists identify the stone used to make an artifact, they can sometimes trace it back to an outcrop many kilometers away. The person who discarded the tool may have carried it directly, or the material may have moved through contacts between groups. Either possibility implies knowledge extending beyond the immediate campsite. Landscapes are not random wilderness to these humans. They are mapped through memory water. Here, shelter there, workable stone beyond that ridge, migrating animals in another valley when the season changes. Hunting leaves even more dramatic evidence. Neanderthals consume a wide range of foods, but large animals form an important part of many assemblages. Cut marks on bones show where stone blades slice through flesh. Impact damage and fracture patterns can reveal attempts to extract marrow. At some sites, the remains of particular species appear in quantities that suggest deliberate hunting rather than occasional scavenging. Wooden spears associated with earlier or related human populations demonstrate that carefully shaped hunting weapons exist deep in prehistory, even though wood almost never survives. Neanderthal spear technology itself likely includes both thrusting and, in some contexts, potentially projected weapons, though exactly how different weapons are used remains debated. Fire fundamentally changes how these lives unfold. Hearths provide warmth, light protection, and a place to process food. Repeated burned areas in caves and open sites show that fire is not an accidental curiosity. It is incorporated into occupation. Around it, stone can be worked after sunset, meat can be cooked, and vulnerable members of a group can remain together during cold conditions. Fire also transforms the social geography of a campsite. People gather around a limited source of light and heat. Their relationships do not fossilize, but the hearth creates a physical center where social life almost certainly occurs. One of the more surprising discoveries is that Neanderthals also use substances that require several stages of production. Birch tar, an adhesive made from birch bark, has been found on ancient tools and at archaeological sites associated with Neanderthals or earlier humans. Producing it involves heating bark under restricted oxygen conditions, though researchers debate how elaborate the required process needed to be. Whatever the precise technique, the result can be used to attach stone elements to handles. A composite tool is more than a shaped rock. It combines multiple materials whose properties must be understood together. Organic materials expand the picture further whenever preservation allows them to survive. Evidence suggests ancient humans' work would use pigments, process hides, and perhaps manufacture cordage or bindings. The absence of surviving baskets, bags, clothing nets, and wooden containers should not be mistaken for proof that such objects did not exist. In most environments, they would disappear long before archaeologists arrive. Stone tools may therefore represent only a small fraction of a much larger technological system. Food remains expose another layer of flexibility. Neanderthals are often portrayed as nearly exclusive hunters of large game, but archaeological evidence paints a more varied picture. Depending on region and season, they consume smaller animals, shellfish, plants, nuts, and other resources. Microscopic residues and dental calculus have produced evidence for plant consumption, although interpreting specific dietary traces can be difficult. Coastal sites show exploitation of marine foods in some areas. The broader pattern suggests local adaptation rather than one rigid menu imposed everywhere. Homo floresiensis presents a different technological puzzle. Despite its small brain and unusual anatomy, stone tools occur in association with its remains and in older layers on Flores. These artifacts are not evidence of modern human levels of technology, but they demonstrate effective stoneworking within an isolated lineage. The implication is important. Brain volume alone cannot predict behavior with any simple formula. A species with a small brain can preserve and transmit useful technological traditions over long periods. At Denisova Cave, the cultural picture becomes harder to assign because different human populations occupy the site at different times. Some remarkable artifacts from the cave, including ornaments and carefully worked objects, occur in layers associated with complex occupation, but determining exactly which population made every object is difficult. Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans all appear in the wider genetic and archaeological history of the cave. The evidence remains incomplete, and researchers must resist attaching impressive artifacts to a particular group simply because the association would be dramatic. The same caution applies to symbolic behavior. Pigments, ornaments, engraved marks, possible burials, and unusual arrangements of objects have all entered debates about the cognitive worlds of extinct humans. Some Neanderthal sites preserve pierced shells or pigment use that may indicate personal decoration or symbolic communication. There is also evidence that some Neanderthals intentionally placed bodies in locations where they were later preserved, although determining whether every case represents formal burial is difficult. What survives in the record suggests behavior more complex than old stereotypes allowed, but archaeology rarely reveals intention with complete certainty. Perhaps the most human evidence comes from individuals who survive serious disability. Some Neanderthal skeletons show injuries or conditions that would have made life difficult for months or years. One famous individual from Shanidar Cave lived despite substantial physical impairment. Earlier interpretations sometimes turn such cases into simple stories of compassion, while later studies have urged more caution about reconstructing exact social relationships. Still, survival after severe injury strongly suggests that cooperation matters. Food sharing, protection, or reduced workloads may have helped vulnerable individuals remain alive. This cooperation would not be unusual in a species dependent on group survival. Hunting dangerous animals, raising slow-developing children, maintaining fire, remembering distant resources, and moving through seasonal landscapes all reward social coordination. Ancient humans do not need to resemble modern societies in every detail for cooperation to be essential. By now, the image of a crude creature wandering almost mindlessly through the Ice Age becomes impossible to maintain. These people make planned tools, manipulate fire, hunt strategically, exploit local plants and animals, carry resources across landscapes, and survive injuries that would be difficult to endure alone. Yet even this archaeological richness reveals only those populations fortunate enough to leave recognizable sites. Others remain nearly invisible. Their camps may have been destroyed. Their bones may never fossilize. Their tools may be impossible to distinguish from those made by neighboring humans. And some of the most extraordinary extinct populations are known not because archaeologists first recognized their artifacts, but because a molecule preserved inside a tiny fragment of bone suddenly revealed that an entirely different kind of human had been standing there all along. The discovery begins with almost nothing. A tiny fragment of finger bone recovered from a cave in the Altai Mountains seems at first too insignificant to change the history of human evolution. It belongs to a young individual who lived tens of thousands of years ago, and by appearance alone it offers little reason to expect anything extraordinary. Yet inside that fragment, protected by the cool conditions of Denisova cave, strands of ancient genetic material survive. When scientists extract and analyze that DNA, the result does not fit the expected categories. It is not modern human. It is not simply Neanderthal. It comes from a population whose existence had never been recognized from fossils. A lost humanity enters science not through a face or skeleton, but through a sequence of genetic code. This is one of the great turning points in the study of the human past. Before ancient DNA, extinct human populations were identified mainly by anatomy and archaeology. Researchers compared skulls, jaws, teeth, limbs, and tools, searching for patterns that might indicate distinct lineages. But bones can be misleading when they are fragmentary, and populations do not always fit neatly into morphological categories. Genetics introduces a different kind of evidence. A small piece of bone can carry information about ancestry relationships, population history, and interbreeding that no visible feature could reveal. The mitochondrial DNA from the Denisova fingerbone first suggests something deeply unusual. Mitochondria are tiny structures inside cells that possess their own DNA passed mainly through the maternal line. The sequence recovered from the bone differs substantially from both modern humans and known Neanderthals. Later analysis of nuclear DNA inherited from both parents reveals a clearer picture. The individual belongs to a population related to Neanderthals but separated from them by a long evolutionary history. These people become known as Denisovans. Almost immediately another mystery appears. If Denisovans existed as a major human lineage, where are their bodies? Unlike Neanderthals, whose fossils have been found across a broad area of Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans remain physically elusive. A few teeth from Denisova Cave are linked to them genetically. Some are strikingly large. Additional fragments emerge, but the collection remains astonishingly small. For a population important enough to leave ancestry in living humans, the lack of an obvious fossil record is difficult to reconcile. The explanation may be that Denisovan fossils have already been found but remain unidentified. Without DNA, a fragmentary jaw or tooth from Asia might have been assigned to another archaic human group or left under a broad classification. Ancient DNA rarely survives in warm environments, so many fossils from southern and eastern Asia cannot be tested easily. Protein analysis offers another route because proteins can survive longer than DNA. This becomes crucial with a powerful clue from the Tibetan Plateau. In Baishiakas Cave, high on the plateau, researchers study a robust human mandible discovered decades earlier. The jaw is ancient and lacks a complete genetic sequence, but proteins preserved in its teeth provide evidence linking it to Denisovan-related humans. The implication is remarkable. Denisovans, or closely related populations, are not merely occupants of Siberian caves. They survive at high altitude in one of the harshest environments inhabited by humans. Later genetic work from sediments at the site strengthens the Denisovan connection to the region. This matters because living Tibetans carry a version of the EPAS1 gene associated with adaptation to low oxygen at high altitude, and genetic evidence indicates that this variant entered modern human populations through archaic introgression closely related to Denisovan ancestry. A biological solution developed in an extinct population becomes useful to Homo sapiens thousands of years later. The people disappear, but part of their adaptation survives. Their genetic legacy stretches much farther south. Some modern populations in New Guinea and neighbouring regions carry substantial Denisovan-related ancestry compared with most other people today. Smaller Denisovan genetic contributions also appear in parts of East and Southeast Asia. These patterns suggest that contact between modern humans and Denisovan-related populations occurs more than once, and perhaps involves multiple Denisovan groups. The simple image of one Denisovan population living around one Siberian cave becomes increasingly impossible to maintain. Genetic studies suggest that Denisovan diversity may have been deep. Some inherited Denisovan segments in modern populations appear sufficiently different from one another to imply contact with distinct archaic populations that had themselves been separated for long periods. Scholars still debate the exact number of interbreeding events and how these populations should be classified. The evidence remains incomplete, particularly because most Denisovan fossils are missing. Yet what survives in the genomes of living people points to a lineage distributed across an enormous and ecologically diverse part of Asia. Ancient DNA can also reveal individual lives with extraordinary precision. One bone fragment from Denisova Cave, originally catalogued without any dramatic expectations, turns out to belong to a girl whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. Geneticists identify her as a first-generation offspring of parents from two different archaic populations. Her father also carries traces of earlier Neanderthal ancestry. The result shows that these populations do not simply exist side by side as distant branches on an evolutionary diagram. They meet repeatedly. The discovery makes human evolution feel less like a tree and more like a network. Lineages divide, but they do not remain permanently isolated. They reconnect. Genes cross boundaries. Populations that look distinct in fossils may still exchange ancestry. Some encounters leave only tiny genetic traces, Others produce descendants whose DNA survives tens of thousands of years later. Even sediments can now reveal those vanished presences. Researchers can extract fragments of ancient human DNA directly from cave deposits without finding a recognizable bone. In layers of Denisova Cave and other sites, genetic material can indicate that Neanderthals or Denisovans occupied a location during particular periods. This turns ordinary-looking soil into a biological archive. A cave floor can preserve traces of people whose bodies have completely vanished. The method is powerful, but it has limits. DNA can become contaminated, fragmented, or chemically damaged. Older samples are harder to recover, and warm climates destroy genetic material rapidly. Cold caves in Siberia offer exceptional preservation conditions that tropical Asia does not. This creates an enormous geographical bias. Human populations that lived in hot or humid regions may have been just as important, yet their DNA is far less likely to survive. That missing evidence may explain why Denisovans still seem almost ghost-like. Their genetic presence is broad, while their fossil presence remains narrow. It is possible that future discoveries in China, Southeast Asia, or other parts of Eurasia will eventually provide skulls and skeletons that can be securely linked to Denisovan populations. It is equally possible that the category itself will become more complicated as additional lineages are identified. For now, Denisovans remain one of the strangest examples of how time can erase a people without erasing every trace of them. Science knows their relationships before it fully knows their faces. Their genes survive in modern humans, their DNA lingers in cave sediment, and their ancestry can be detected across continents. Yet the physical population remains almost invisible. And once genetics proves that an entire human lineage can hide in plain sight for so long, a far more unsettling possibility emerges. Denisovans may not be the only ones. Other vanished populations may have left no recognized bones at all, surviving only as faint genetic signals inside the people alive today. Once scientists learn that an extinct human population can be discovered through DNA before its skeleton is recognized, another possibility becomes difficult to ignore. There may have been other human groups whose bones have not yet been identified at all. They may have lived for thousands of generations, encountered the ancestors of living people, exchanged genes with them, and then disappeared so completely that no securely identified fossil carries their name. Their presence survives only indirectly, hidden inside stretches of modern DNA that do not fit comfortably within the ancestry of known populations. These are sometimes described as ghost populations, not because anything supernatural is involved, but because their genetic influence can be detected while the people themselves remain almost invisible. The idea emerges from comparison. Human genomes are not uniform records of one uninterrupted lineage. They preserve layers of ancestry produced by ancient population splits, migrations, bottlenecks, and interbreeding. Neanderthal ancestry in many people living outside Africa provides a clear example. Denisovan ancestry provides another. Because scientists possess Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, stretches of modern DNA can be compared directly with those archaic sequences. But sometimes genetic patterns suggest contributions from populations for which no reference genome exists. Researchers then have to work backward from the signal. This is extraordinarily difficult. A genetic pattern that looks like interbreeding with an unknown archaic population can sometimes be produced by other processes. Ancient population structure within Homo sapiens, for example, can create deep genetic differences without requiring contact with a completely separate species. Groups may divide for long periods, and later reconnect, leaving signatures that resemble introgression from outsiders. Population sizes also change through time, and these demographic shifts can distort genetic patterns in ways that are easy to misinterpret. For this reason, claims about unknown archaic humans are approached cautiously. Scholars still debate how many ghost populations can be confidently inferred and what biological categories they represent. Africa is central to the problem. The continent contains the deepest history of Homo sapiens and related ancestral populations, yet warm climates are generally hostile to ancient DNA preservation. Fossils exist, but many are incomplete, and their relationships are often contested. Meanwhile, modern African genomes preserve extraordinary diversity. Some studies have identified genetic patterns consistent with ancestry from deeply divergent populations that may have interbred with ancestors of later Africans. Whether those contributors represent separate archaic species, long isolated Homo sapiens populations, or a more complex structure remains unresolved. The distinction matters because the word species can oversimplify what ancient humans actually were. A population may be genetically distinct for hundreds of thousands of years without becoming completely reproductively isolated. Neanderthals and modern humans demonstrate this clearly. They differ substantially in anatomy and ancestry, yet they produce descendants when they meet. Denisovans do the same. Human evolution therefore contains boundaries that are real but permeable. A ghost population detected genetically might represent something that paleoanthropologists would name as a separate species if a complete skull appeared tomorrow, or it might belong to a deeply separated branch of early Homo sapiens. Genetics alone cannot always decide. Asia may hide similar mysteries. The fossil record there includes human remains that resist easy classification. Some skulls and jaws show combinations of archaic and more recent traits. Others have been proposed as possible Denisovan relatives, but without recoverable DNA firm assignments remain difficult. The problem is especially severe in tropical Southeast Asia, where genetic material decays rapidly. A fossil can survive while its molecular identity is completely erased. This creates a strange reversal. For some extinct humans, scientists possess bones but no DNA. For Denisovans, they initially possessed DNA with almost no anatomy. For possible ghost populations, they may possess neither identifiable bones nor an ancient genome, only traces left after interbreeding with descendants who survived. Human evolution must therefore be reconstructed from several incomplete archives, each preserving different information. Modern statistical methods attempt to separate these signals. Researchers compare patterns of mutations across genomes, estimate how long segments of ancestry have been recombining, and model different histories of population separation and contact. Long inherited segments generally indicate more recent ancestry, while older introgressed material becomes broken into smaller pieces over generations. But real demographic histories are complicated, and different models can sometimes fit the same data. The result is not a hidden photograph waiting to be developed. It is a set of probabilities constrained by incomplete evidence. Even so, the possibility of unknown humans is supported by a broader lesson from the past few decades. Again and again, discoveries have expanded the number of recognized human populations. Homo floresiensis was unknown until the 21st century. Denisovans were unknown until genetic analysis revealed them. Homo luzonensis emerged from a handful of remains that did not fit existing expectations. New fossils continue to complicate older categories. It would therefore be surprising if every significant branch of ancient humanity had already been found. The archaeological record makes disappearance easy. Most individuals leave no fossil at all. Most campsites are destroyed or buried beyond reach. Coastlines used by prehistoric people are now submerged in many regions because sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age. Rivers erode old sediments. Tropical soils dissolve bone. caves collapse, tectonic movement buries landscapes. Vast regions have received only limited archaeological investigation. A population can occupy an area for tens of millennia and still leave almost nothing that modern researchers can securely identify. There is also the problem of similarity. Distinct populations do not necessarily make distinct tools. If two human groups use comparable stoneworking methods, artifacts alone may not reveal who made them. A stone flake does not carry a species label. Technologies can be shared independently developed or maintained across long periods by neighboring populations. Without associated fossils or DNA, an archaeological site may reveal intelligent human activity while leaving the biological identity of its occupants unresolved. This has important consequences for how ancient encounters are imagined. A region that appears on a map to contain only one known human population may once have contained several. Groups could move through overlapping territories at different seasons or during different climatic phases. One population might occupy a cave for centuries, disappear locally, and be replaced by another thousands of years later. At other times they might meet directly. The traces of such meetings can survive long after the participants themselves become unrecognizable. A useful gene can spread into another population. A neutral genetic segment can persist by chance. Most inherited material may disappear through generations of recombination, leaving only scattered fragments. Eventually, the original population may vanish from the landscape, while pieces of its ancestry continue inside descendants who no longer look or live like them. That possibility changes what extinction means. A lost population does not have to end in one final catastrophic moment. It may shrink, gradually merge repeatedly with neighbors, and lose its distinctiveness generation by generation. Thousands of years later, scientists may see only a faint statistical echo. These ghost signals therefore represent more than missing fossils. They suggest that the human family tree still contains branches without names, faces without skulls, and histories that may never be fully recovered. Some could eventually step out of obscurity through a single remarkable fossil or preserved genome. Others may remain permanently anonymous, but anonymous does not mean irrelevant. If their genes entered surviving populations, then they participated directly in the ancestry of later humans. And once different lineages begin crossing into one another's territories, the history of humanity stops being a story of isolated branches and becomes a story of encounters, some brief, some repeated, and some intimate, enough to leave descendants. When different human populations finally meet, the encounter is not a single dramatic event, but a process repeated across enormous stretches of time and geography. The expanding groups of Homo sapiens moving beyond Africa do not enter an empty continent. They move into landscapes already occupied by Neanderthals, Denisovan-related populations, and perhaps other groups whose identities remain uncertain. Some encounters may last only a generation. Others may occur again and again as populations follow rivers, coastlines, game herds, and shifting climatic corridors. The archaeological record rarely preserves the moment of contact itself, but genetics leaves a clearer trace. These humans do not merely see one another from a distance. Some of them have children together. For decades, this possibility was controversial. Neanderthals were often imagined as a separate evolutionary branch that disappeared without contributing meaningfully to modern humans. Early genetic studies seemed to support a clean separation, but improved sequencing changed the picture. When researchers obtained high-quality Neanderthal genomes and compared them with living populations, a consistent pattern emerged. Most people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal-derived DNA. The exact amount varies among populations and individuals, but the overall conclusion is clear. Ancestors of modern humans interbred with Neanderthals after some Homo sapiens populations expanded out of Africa. The contact probably occurs more than once. Genetic patterns are not best explained by a single meeting between two isolated groups. Instead, repeated episodes of interbreeding appear to have taken place in different regions and at different times. Later migrations reshuffle this ancestry further. Some modern populations carry slightly more Neanderthal ancestry than others, partly because of later demographic history and possible additional encounters. The surviving genome is therefore a complicated residue of many movements, rather than a clean record of one migration. Denisovan ancestry reveals an even more geographically complex history. Populations ancestral to people in parts of Oceania carry substantial Denisovan-related ancestry, while smaller contributions occur across parts of Asia. Genetic differences among those inherited segments suggest that modern humans may have encountered more than one Denisovan population. If Denisovans were themselves deeply divided across Asia, then Homo sapiens did not meet one uniform archaic group, but multiple related populations spread across different environments. One bone from Denisova Cave gives this broader pattern an individual face, even though no face survives. The fragment belongs to a young female whose genome shows that her mother was Neanderthal and her father Denisovan. Scientists sometimes refer to her informally as Denisova 11. Her existence proves that the two archaic groups produced offspring directly. Even more strikingly, her Denisovan father carries traces of Neanderthal ancestry from an earlier mixing event. Interbreeding is not an isolated accident confined to one generation. The lineages had already crossed before her parents met. This does not mean that different human populations merged freely wherever they encountered one another. Genetic evidence also suggests barriers. Some archaic DNA appears to have been removed from modern human genomes over time, probably because certain inherited variants were disadvantageous in a new genetic background. Regions of the genome associated with male fertility show especially reduced Neanderthal ancestry, which may indicate that some hybrid combinations had lower reproductive success. The precise mechanisms remain debated, but the patterns suggest partial biological incompatibilities had developed during long separation. Yet those barriers were incomplete. Enough hybrids survived and reproduced for archaic ancestry to persist until the present. This creates an evolutionary boundary that is neither complete separation nor complete unity. Traditional species labels become useful but imperfect tools. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens are clearly distinct populations with long, independent histories, but they remain genetically compatible enough to exchange ancestry. Their relationships resemble branches that separate widely and then reconnect at scattered points. What happens culturally when they meet is much harder to reconstruct. Stone tools sometimes change around periods when populations overlap, but linking those changes directly to cultural exchange is difficult. Similar technologies can arise independently, and archaeological layers can mix over time. Some late Neanderthal industries contain objects or techniques that have been interpreted as evidence of influence from incoming Homo sapiens. Other researchers argue that Neanderthals were capable of developing such innovations independently. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of regional evidence. Personal ornaments make the debate especially interesting. Shells, pigments, modified animal parts, and decorative objects appear at some sites associated with Neanderthals. If these behaviors develop before substantial contact with Homo sapiens, they strengthen the case for independent symbolic traditions. If some appear after contact, cultural transmission becomes plausible. The chronology is difficult, and the evidence remains incomplete. Either way, the older stereotype of one creative population encountering another incapable of innovation has become increasingly difficult to defend. The encounters themselves are impossible to reduce to one emotional story. Some may involve cooperation or exchange. Others may involve avoidance, competition, or violence. Groups hunting the same prey and seeking the same shelters could become rivals, particularly during periods of environmental stress. At the same time, interbreeding proves that at least some relationships crossed population boundaries. Whether these unions emerge from long-term social integration, brief encounters, coercion, or combinations of circumstances cannot usually be known from genetic data. Population size probably mattered enormously. Homo sapiens groups expanding into Eurasia may have been part of larger and more interconnected social networks than some local archaic populations. Broader networks can provide advantages that have little to do with individual intelligence. If one group loses members during a harsh winter contact with neighboring communities, may allow recovery through migration, exchange, or marriage. Small, isolated groups have fewer options. A population can be highly adapted and technologically capable while remaining demographically fragile. Genetic evidence supports the idea that Neanderthal populations were often relatively small. Their genomes show signs of low effective population size and periods of inbreeding in some regions. This does not mean every Neanderthal group was permanently isolated, but it suggests that their broader population network was limited compared with later expanding Homo sapiens. When newcomers arrive in increasing numbers, even modest differences in population growth can become decisive over thousands of years, but replacement is not complete. As Homo sapiens spreads, it carries pieces of the people it encounters. Neanderthal genes move into populations that eventually occupy enormous parts of the planet. Denisovan genes travel with humans into regions where Denisovans themselves disappear. Some inherited variants fade away while others persist because they are neutral or useful. This is one of the most important contradictions in the story of vanished humans. Contact contributes both to disappearance and survival. A smaller population can lose its distinct identity as it is absorbed into a larger one while simultaneously passing parts of itself into the population replacing it. Extinction and ancestry are therefore not opposites. By the time Neanderthals and Denisovan populations vanish as recognizable groups, they have already entered the genetic history of Homo sapiens. Their territories change hands, their characteristic anatomies disappear, and their independent evolutionary stories end. But some of their biology continues moving forward inside another humanity, and those inherited fragments are not merely decorative remnants of the past. In several cases, they alter how modern humans respond to disease, climate, altitude, and the environments into which our species continues to expand. The vanished humans do not disappear completely when their bodies vanish from the landscape. By the time Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic populations cease to exist as recognizable groups, parts of their genomes have already crossed into expanding Homo sapiens populations. Those inherited fragments are carried forward through thousands of generations, broken apart and reshuffled every time chromosomes recombine. Most become small scattered pieces. Some disappear entirely. Others remain surprisingly common. A person living today can therefore carry genetic material inherited from humans who vanished tens of thousands of years ago without possessing any visible sign that this ancestry is there. The lost populations survive not as intact biological packages, but as fragments woven into a much larger genome. At first, archaic ancestry was often discussed mainly as evidence that interbreeding occurred, but the deeper question is what those inherited genes actually did. Not all introgressed DNA has the same effect. Some variants are probably neutral, neither strongly helpful nor harmful. Others appear to have reduced reproductive success or created disadvantages in later populations and were gradually removed by natural selection. A smaller number seem to have offered useful adaptations in particular environments. These surviving fragments reveal that interbreeding was not only a demographic event, it sometimes transferred evolutionary solutions from one human population to another. The clearest example comes from high altitude. On the Tibetan Plateau, oxygen pressure is far lower than at sea level, creating severe physiological challenges. People who live there today possess biological adaptations that allow them to function more effectively in this environment. One important genetic region involves the EPAS1 gene, which helps regulate the body's response to low oxygen. The version common in many Tibetan populations is closely related to archaic DNA, associated with Denisovan ancestry. The most likely explanation is that ancestors of modern Tibetans acquired this variant through interbreeding with Denisovan-related humans, whose populations had already spent long periods adapting to high-altitude conditions. This is evolution through borrowing. Homo sapiens arrives in or near an environment where another human lineage has already survived for many generations. Instead of waiting for the same useful mutation to arise independently, the newcomer inherits an existing adaptation through interbreeding. Natural selection then increases its frequency because individuals carrying it have an advantage under low oxygen conditions. The extinct population becomes in a sense part of the biological equipment that allows the surviving population to thrive. Immune function provides another major area of archaic influence. Neanderthals and Denisovans had lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before some Homo sapiens populations expanded there. During that time, they were exposed to local pathogens. Their immune systems evolved under pressures different from those experienced by populations remaining in Africa. When Homo sapiens interbred with them, some immune-related variants entered modern genomes. Several archaic-derived genes involved in innate immune responses appear to have risen in frequency, suggesting that they may have helped newcomers respond to unfamiliar infectious environments. But an immune system that reacts strongly is not always beneficial. The same variants that provide protection against infection under one set of conditions can increase the risk of inflammatory or autoimmune problems under another. This is one reason ancient adaptations can become complicated legacies. Natural selection does not produce perfect genes. It favors variants that improve reproductive success in a particular environment, even if those same variants have costs elsewhere or later. Archaic ancestry has also been linked to traits involving skin and hair biology, metabolism, fat storage, and responses to environmental stress. Some Neanderthal-derived variants influence keratin-related processes, which may have affected skin or hair characteristics in Eurasian climates. Other inherited regions have been investigated for associations with metabolism and body fat distribution. The effects of individual variants are often small, and many popular claims about archaic genes oversimplify what genetic studies actually show. Scholars still debate the precise biological importance of numerous inherited segments, and association does not always reveal the original evolutionary reason a variant survived. One surprising example concerns the way ancient genes can interact with modern disease. Certain Neanderthal-derived genetic regions have been associated with increased or decreased susceptibility to particular illnesses. During recent research into infectious disease, some archaic haplotypes were found to affect risks connected with severe immune responses. Yet it would be misleading to describe Neanderthal DNA simply as harmful or protective. Different archaic variants can have opposite effects, and modern disease environments are radically different from those in which these genes first evolved. This highlights an important principle. the genetic legacy of extinct humans is not a collection of curiosities preserved unchanged from the Ice Age. It is an active part of modern biology, shaped by later selection and demographic history. Once archaic genes enter Homo sapiens populations, they become subject to the same evolutionary pressures as any other genetic material. Useful variants may spread, harmful ones may decline, neutral ones may drift randomly through generations. Large parts of the genome show unusually little Neanderthal ancestry. These regions are sometimes described as archaic deserts. Their existence suggests that certain combinations of Neanderthal and modern human genes were disadvantageous and were removed over time. Some of the strongest reductions occur near genes involved in reproduction, which may point to reduced fertility among some male hybrids. The exact mechanisms remain under study, but the pattern supports the idea that these populations had been separated long enough for partial biological incompatibilities to develop. This makes the successful introgression elsewhere even more significant. The archaic DNA that survives today has passed through tens of thousands of years of evolutionary filtering. It is not a random sample of the original Neanderthal or Denisovan genome. Much has been lost. What remains is bias toward regions that were tolerated neutral or occasionally advantageous. There is another subtle consequence. No living person carries the complete genome of a Neanderthal ancestor, yet different people preserve different fragments. When researchers combine archaic segments found across many living individuals, they can recover a substantial portion of genetic variation inherited from extinct populations. Humanity becomes a kind of distributed archive. Pieces of ancient genomes survive not in one body, but across millions of descendants. The distribution is also uneven. Many populations outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry, but later migrations and back migrations have complicated the picture. Denisovan ancestry varies even more strongly, reaching particularly high levels in some populations of Oceania, while appearing in smaller amounts elsewhere in Asia. These differences trace ancient routes of contact that archaeology alone might never reveal. Genes therefore preserve meetings that occurred in landscapes now transformed beyond recognition. They tell of populations encountering one another somewhere in Western Asia, Siberia, Southeast Asia, or other regions whose precise locations may remain unknown. They record contact without explaining what the people thought of one another. They reveal ancestry without preserving language names or social customs, and that limitation is important. A useful Denisovan-derived adaptation does not tell us what Denisovan society looked like. A Neanderthal immune variant cannot reveal how a group organized a hunt or raised a child. Genetics preserves biology far better than experience. Still, the legacy is profound. The humans that disappeared did not simply fail and leave the surviving species untouched. They contributed to it. Their adaptations became available to populations entering new climates. Their genes altered immune responses and physiology. Some of their biological history continues every time a modern cell reads an inherited sequence that first evolved in another kind of human. By the time Homo sapiens becomes the dominant human across Eurasia, the species is therefore already a mosaic. Its expanding populations carry pieces of vanished lineages with them. Yet this genetic inheritance unfolds during a period when the demographic balance is changing rapidly. Modern humans are spreading into territories occupied for millennia by other populations, and the scale of that expansion begins to transform the human world permanently. The transformation does not happen in a single wave. There is no moment when Homo sapiens suddenly appears across Eurasia, and every other human population vanishes before it. Instead, modern humans expand unevenly, sometimes advancing into new regions, sometimes retreating when climates worsen, and sometimes occupying the same broad landscapes as archaic humans for thousands of years. The process resembles a shift and frontier rather than a clean replacement. Camps appear, disappear, and reappear. Populations move through valleys and along coastlines that later become unrecognizable. Yet over time, one pattern becomes increasingly difficult to miss. Homo sapiens begins to occupy more territory in larger numbers with connections that seem to reach farther across the landscape. This demographic difference may have mattered as much as any anatomical or technological advantage. A small population can survive for an extraordinarily long time when conditions remain favorable, but it is vulnerable to disruption. If a local group contains only a few dozen individuals and several adults die during a harsh winter, a failed hunt or an epidemic recovery may be slow. If neighboring groups are distant or equally small, new members cannot easily arrive. Genetic diversity declines, inbreeding becomes more likely, and the population may eventually disappear even without a dramatic catastrophe. Neanderthal genomes suggest that at least some populations experienced precisely this kind of demographic fragility. Homo sapiens populations may have been able to buffer such losses through wider social networks. Archaeologists sometimes find materials transported over long distances, including stone shell pigment and decorative objects. These movements do not prove the existence of large political or economic systems, but they suggest that information and materials could circulate across networks, connecting multiple groups. In difficult environments, such connections are valuable. Knowledge of a distant water source, a seasonal herd movement, or a safer migration route can matter as much as a stronger spear. A population that can exchange information across a wide territory is less dependent on the success of one local group. Symbolic objects may also strengthen these networks. Beads, pigments, pendants, and other forms of personal display appear in increasing numbers at some early Homo sapiens sites. Their meaning cannot be directly recovered, but visible symbols can communicate identity, affiliation, age status, or social relationships. If an ornament helps a stranger recognize that another person belongs to a familiar network, it may facilitate cooperation beyond the immediate family group. This interpretation remains debated, and not every ornament must have served the same function. Still, symbolic communication could have expanded the scale at which human groups recognized one another. Language would magnify these advantages enormously, although language itself leaves almost no direct fossil evidence. Modern humans clearly possess complex language, while Neanderthal anatomy and genetics suggest that they were also capable of sophisticated vocal communication. It would therefore be simplistic to imagine a speaking Homo sapiens confronting silent Neanderthals. The important difference, if there was one, may have concerned how communication was organized socially, how much information could be transmitted across generations, or how large the connected network became. Those details are almost impossible to measure archaeologically. Technology also changes during the period of expansion, but again the pattern is not a simple divide between inventive modern humans and static archaic humans. Neanderthals modify their toolkits across time and region. Late Neanderthal sites sometimes contain sophisticated technologies and personal ornaments. Meanwhile, not every early Homo sapien site contains elaborate tools. Nevertheless, modern human populations eventually show a remarkably broad range of technologies, including projectile systems, bone and antler tools, tailored clothing equipment in some regions, fishing technologies, ornaments and specialized methods for exploiting local resources. The importance of this flexibility becomes clear when Homo sapiens enters extreme environments. Modern humans spread into cold northern regions, arid interiors, tropical forests, highlands, and eventually remote islands. Each landscape demands different knowledge. Arctic survival requires insulation shelter and careful use of seasonal resources. Coastal environments reward understanding of tides and marine foods. Tropical forests contain abundant life, but can be difficult places for large game hunting and navigation. Rather than relying on one ecological strategy, Homo sapiens repeatedly develops local solutions. Mobility is another part of the story. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels are far lower than today, exposing vast areas of continental shelf. Much of western Indonesia is connected into the larger landmass known as Sundaland, while Australia and New Guinea form Sahul. Yet deep water channels still separate these regions. Reaching Sahul therefore requires sea crossings. The exact nature of the boats or rafts used does not survive, but modern humans arrived there tens of thousands of years ago. Even allowing for accidental drift in some circumstances, successful colonization across multiple water barriers strongly suggests substantial maritime capability and planning. Such movements place Homo sapiens in contact with ecosystems and human populations that had followed separate histories. Somewhere across Asia, modern humans meet Denisovan-related groups. In Europe and Western Asia, they meet Neanderthals. In Southeast Asia, they enter a region where Homo floresiensis and perhaps other archaic populations had existed. The timing of direct overlap in some places remains uncertain, but the broader expansion transforms the demographic balance throughout the Old World. Climate creates both opportunities and crises during this process. The late Pleistocene contains abrupt swings in temperature and precipitation. Habitats can change within centuries or even decades. Forests expand into regions once dominated by open steppe, then retreat. Animal populations move with the vegetation. A human group specialized around a narrow ecological system may struggle when that system fragments. Flexible subsistence and wider social networks become powerful forms of insurance. Yet it is dangerous to turn this into a story of inevitable Homo sapien superiority. Neanderthals had already survived repeated climatic upheavals for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovan-related humans occupied environments ranging from Siberian cold to high-altitude plateaus and probably tropical Asia. Their disappearance cannot simply be explained by a failure to adapt. Something changes when Homo sapiens joins an already unstable landscape, but the exact combination of factors varies from region to region. Population modeling shows how small differences can accumulate. If one population has only a slightly higher birth rate, lower mortality, or greater ability to attract members from neighboring groups, it can expand over generations without requiring direct extermination. Imagine two populations using similar territories. One is small and fragmented. The other maintains slightly denser networks and produces more surviving children. Over a few lifetimes, the difference may appear minor. Over several thousand years, the demographic result can be enormous. Interbreeding accelerates the process in another way. When members of a small archaic population have children with members of a larger expanding Homo sapiens population, their descendants may increasingly identify biologically and socially with the larger population. Archaic genes survive, but the distinct population shrinks. No battle is necessary for this form of disappearance. Assimilation can erase a population gradually. Disease may also play a role, although direct evidence is difficult to recover. Long-separated populations could carry pathogens or immune adaptations unfamiliar to one another. Contact might therefore create uneven disease burdens, much as later historical encounters between isolated human populations sometimes did. But there is currently no clear evidence for one epidemic that explains Neanderthal extinction, and such scenarios remain hypothetical. Competition for prey and shelter is more visible but still difficult to quantify. Modern humans and Neanderthals sometimes hunt similar animals and favor similar environments. During climatic stress, even limited overlap could increase pressure on food sources. If Homo sapiens groups are more numerous, they need not be individually better hunters to alter access to resources. Numbers alone can change the ecological landscape. By roughly 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record, though exact dates vary by region and continue to be refined. Denisovan populations persist somewhere in Asia for uncertain periods, but their archaeological disappearance is even harder to trace because their fossils are so scarce. Other human groups vanish on their own timelines. What remains is a planet moving toward an extraordinary condition one human species spread across increasingly vast territories. But the path to that outcome is not a triumphant march. It is a demographic transformation involving migration, climate technology, interbreeding competition and chance. And as the other humans begin to disappear, the hardest question becomes unavoidable. Why them and not us? There is no single graveyard containing the answer. No layer of ash marks the moment when Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other ancient humans suddenly disappear everywhere at once. Instead, the evidence fades unevenly. A population is present in one region, then absent from later deposits. Another persists farther south or east. Some sites suggest overlap with Homo sapiens, while others show long gaps between occupations. Dates shift as improved methods refine old estimates. New fossils occasionally complicate what once seemed settled. The result is a disappearance without one obvious cause, and that may be because there was never one cause to begin with. Neanderthals provide the clearest case. For hundreds of thousands of years they survived changing climates across Europe and parts of Western Asia. They endure cold periods, warmer intervals, environmental instability, and repeated changes in prey and vegetation. Then, during the later Pleistocene, their archaeological presence contracts. By around 40,000 years ago, they largely disappear from the record. Homo sapiens is spreading through many of the same regions at roughly the same time. The coincidence is impossible to ignore, but coincidence alone does not reveal mechanism. Competition is one obvious possibility. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens often depend on overlapping resources. Both hunt large animals, use caves and rock shelters, need fresh water, gather plant foods, and search for high-quality stone. If two populations occupy the same valley during a period when animal herds are shrinking, even small differences in efficiency or numbers could matter. Homo sapiens does not need to wage a deliberate war of extermination. Simply maintaining slightly larger populations or exploiting a wider range of resources could gradually reduce the space available to smaller groups. Yet direct evidence of widespread violent conflict is surprisingly limited. Prehistoric skeletons sometimes preserve injuries, but proving that a wound was caused by a member of another human population is almost impossible. A fracture might come from hunting an accident conflict within a group or an encounter with outsiders. The archaeological record contains no clear continental-scale pattern, showing organized warfare between Neanderthals and modern humans. Violence may have occurred as it does among many human societies, but there is little basis for making it the sole explanation for extinction. Climate is another major candidate. The period surrounding Neanderthal disappearance includes episodes of rapid environmental change. Temperature shifts can alter vegetation within comparatively short spans, reorganizing the distribution of animals and forcing human groups to change their movements. Neanderthals had survived previous climatic crises, but that does not make them invulnerable to later ones. A population already reduced in number may be less capable of surviving another severe disruption, especially if competitors are simultaneously entering its territory. This interaction may be more important than climate alone. A cold event does not need to kill a population directly. It can reduce prey fragment habitats, force groups into smaller refuges, and weaken connections between communities. If Homo sapiens populations possess wider social networks or greater demographic density, they may recover more effectively after each crisis. Neanderthals already living in small dispersed groups may suffer losses that accumulate. Genetics provides strong evidence for such vulnerability. Some late Neanderthal genomes reveal low genetic diversity and close parental relatedness. One individual from the Altai region had parents who were themselves closely related, indicating a very small local population. Other genetic studies suggest low effective population sizes over long periods. This does not mean all Neanderthals were constantly inbred, but it shows that demographic isolation could become severe. In small populations, random events carry enormous weight. A handful of deaths, failed births, or missing reproductive age adults can permanently alter the future. Disease adds another possibility. When previously separated populations meet, each can introduce pathogens unfamiliar to the other. Homo sapiens expanding from Africa and neighboring regions may have carried diseases to which Neanderthals had limited resistance. Neanderthals may likewise have transmitted Eurasian pathogens to modern humans. Some archaic immune genes inherited by Homo sapiens may have been useful precisely because they offered protection against local infections. But no specific epidemic has been identified as the event that eliminated Neanderthals. Ancient pathogens are difficult to recover, and the evidence remains incomplete. There are also biological differences that might have affected reproduction. Genetic patterns suggest that some combinations of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens ancestry were selected against, particularly in parts of the genome related to male fertility. This indicates that hybrid offspring were not always equally fertile or healthy. However, interbreeding clearly produced many successful descendants, so reproductive incompatibility was partial rather than absolute. It may have influenced population dynamics without preventing gene flow entirely. Another theory concerns childhood and population growth. Homo sapiens may have had demographic advantages involving birth spacing, infant survival, social support, or the ability to maintain larger networks of potential mates. These factors rarely fossilize, making them especially difficult to test. Yet even a tiny advantage in population growth can produce dramatic consequences over several thousand years. If one population grows by only a small percentage more per generation, it can eventually become overwhelmingly more numerous. Technology is often placed at the center of the explanation, but it too resists simplicity. Modern humans eventually develop highly diverse toolkits, specialized hunting systems, long-distance exchange, bone tools, ornaments, and other innovations. But Neanderthals also produce sophisticated technologies. They control fire, make composite tools, manufacture adhesives, hunt dangerous animals, and adapt their methods to local environments. Some late Neanderthal groups use ornaments and pigments. The contrast is therefore not between intelligence and stupidity. It may instead involve differences in the rate at which innovation spread, how knowledge moves between groups, and how efficiently communities recover lost skills when local populations disappear. This is where network size may become decisive. Imagine two groups capable of inventing the same useful tool. One population consists of a few scattered communities with limited contact. The other participates in a wider network of dozens of connected groups. If the skilled individual in the isolated population dies before transmitting the technique, the innovation can disappear. In the larger network, the same knowledge may survive in several places. Over many generations, cultural resilience itself becomes an evolutionary advantage, but even this cannot fully explain every vanished human. Denisovan disappearance is harder to trace because Denisovan populations are so poorly represented by fossils. Homo floresiensis survives in isolation on Flores until relatively late in prehistory, with the youngest securely dated evidence still debated as archaeological chronologies are refined. Homo luzonensis is known from too little material to identify the circumstances of its disappearance. Other ancient populations may vanish before Homo sapiens reaches their regions, meaning modern human competition cannot explain all extinctions. Chance must therefore remain part of the story. Evolutionary history is full of lineages destroyed not because they are poorly adapted, but because circumstances change in the wrong sequence. A volcanic eruption, drought, epidemic, prey, collapse, or demographic accident can be survivable for a large connected population and fatal for a small isolated one. There is no rule guaranteeing that the most intelligent, strongest, or best adapted lineage survives every crisis. And then there is the possibility that disappearance is not always true extinction in the strictest sense. When Neanderthals vanish as a recognizable population, their DNA is already present in Homo sapiens. When Denisovan groups disappear, parts of their genomes continue in living populations from Asia to Oceania. A small population surrounded by a larger one can vanish through absorption as effectively as through death. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Climate weakens populations. Small numbers make recovery difficult. Competition increases pressure. Interbreeding absorbs boundaries. Disease may contribute. Cultural networks may favor one group over another. Chance determines which communities are struck hardest. Together, these forces can produce disappearance without requiring one dramatic final event. The strange human species that time erased may therefore have ended not with one last survivor standing alone in an empty valley, but through thousands of smaller endings, a group that fails to recover after winter, a community absorbed by neighbors, a lineage reduced by isolation, a child born into a mixed family whose descendants no longer carry the old identity. The species disappears gradually, while pieces of it continue moving forward. Extinction sounds absolute. It suggests a final death, a clean ending in which the last member of a species disappears and nothing remains except bones. For some ancient humans, something close to that may have happened. Small isolated populations could have dwindled until no individuals remained. But the genetic evidence forces a different possibility into the story of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other vanished groups. A population can disappear without every ancestral line ending. It can lose its identity by becoming part of another population. Bodies continue, children continue, genes continue. What vanishes is the distinct human group that once carried them together. Imagine the process not over a year or a century, but across several thousand years. A small Neanderthal population occupies a landscape where larger networks of Homo sapiens are gradually becoming established. At first, the groups may remain mostly separate. They hunt across neighboring territories and occasionally encounter one another. Some contacts result in children. Those children carry ancestry from both populations. If they remain within a Neanderthal community, modern human ancestry can enter that population. If they join a Homo sapiens group, Neanderthal ancestry moves in the opposite direction. Now repeat the process across generations while the demographic balance shifts. If Homo sapiens populations continue growing and Neanderthal populations continue shrinking, an increasing proportion of mixed descendants will belong to the larger population network. Eventually, there may be no community that is predominantly Neanderthal, even though many individuals carry Neanderthal ancestors. The population has disappeared as a distinct evolutionary unit without requiring every member to have been killed. Genetics supports at least part of this picture. Neanderthal DNA survives in living people, proving successful interbreeding. But modern humans also contributed ancestry to Neanderthals. Genetic studies have identified signals indicating gene flow from lineages related to Homo sapiens into Neanderthal populations before the major expansion of modern humans across Eurasia. Contact therefore occurred during more than one period and moved genes in both directions. The boundaries between these populations were porous long before one of them disappeared. This makes the familiar image of replacement too simple. A map showing Neanderthal territory changing colour as Homo sapiens spreads can look like one population physically pushes another off the continent. Reality may have been far messier. In some regions there may indeed have been competition and local replacement. Elsewhere groups could have merged. Some Neanderthal communities may have disappeared before meeting Homo sapiens at all. Others may have contributed descendants to the expanding population. Different endings could occur simultaneously in different valleys. The mathematics of absorption can be surprisingly powerful. When a small population repeatedly interbreeds with a much larger one, its distinctive genome becomes diluted rapidly. After each generation, recombination breaks ancestral chromosomes into smaller segments. A descendant several generations later may carry only a fraction of the ancestry of one archaic ancestor. Across an entire population, some segments disappear through chance, while others survive. Eventually, the original genome is scattered across thousands or millions of descendants, rather than concentrated in one recognizable group. Natural selection then reshapes what remains. Some archaic variants are removed because they interact poorly with the genetic background of Homo sapiens. Others persist because their effects are neutral. A few become common because they offer useful adaptations. The surviving archaic ancestry is therefore not a miniature Neanderthal or Denisovan genome hidden intact inside modern people. It is a filtered collection of fragments. The Denisovan story may have involved even more extensive absorption. Their ancestry survives in modern populations across a huge geographical range, yet Denisovan fossils remain extraordinarily rare. This suggests that the population history behind the name was complex. Different Denisovan-related groups may have encountered Homo sapiens independently. Some could have disappeared through demographic collapse, while others were partially absorbed. The genetic legacy seen today may therefore represent several vanished populations rather than one uniform people. This raises a difficult question about identity. At what point does a population cease to exist? Biology provides no simple answer. Species names are categories imposed by researchers on evolutionary continua. They are extremely useful for describing patterns, but ancient populations did not organize themselves according to modern taxonomic labels. A child with one Neanderthal parent and one Denisovan parent does not fit comfortably into a diagram that demands clean boundaries. Neither do later descendants carrying ancestry from several lineages. Culture complicates the issue further. A population can lose genetic distinctiveness while cultural practices survive or maintain genetic continuity while its culture changes dramatically. Unfortunately, archaeology rarely allows researchers to trace these processes directly for extinct humans. Stone tool traditions cannot automatically be assigned to biological populations. A technique might spread through imitation between groups. An incoming population might adopt local knowledge. A mixed community might combine practices inherited from both sides. If Neanderthals were gradually absorbed in some regions, parts of their cultural knowledge could theoretically have moved into Homo sapiens communities as well. The archaeological evidence cannot securely identify many such transfers, but the possibility is important. Incoming humans would have entered landscapes Neanderthals had known for generations. Local populations understood seasonal prey movements, stone sources, caves, water, dangerous terrain, and edible resources. Knowledge of such things can be exchanged far more quickly than genes. There is a tendency to imagine disappearing populations as passive victims waiting for a more successful species to replace them. Absorption presents a different picture. It requires interaction. Individuals cross population boundaries. Children connect lineages. Knowledge may move in both directions. The final disappearance can emerge from ordinary human relationships operating under unequal demographic conditions. None of this means assimilation explains everything. The amount of surviving Neanderthal ancestry in modern genomes is too limited to suggest that entire Neanderthal populations simply transformed wholesale into modern humans. Much Neanderthal genetic diversity was lost. Many communities probably left no surviving descendants. Population decline was real, and extinction at the group level still occurred. Scholars continue to debate how important absorption was relative to competition, environmental change, and demographic collapse. Yet even limited assimilation changes the meaning of the ending. The Neanderthals do not vanish in the same way as an animal lineage that leaves no descendants in any surviving population. Their independent evolutionary history ends, but some of their ancestry crosses that boundary. Denisovan populations do the same. The distinction between survivor and extinct relative becomes less absolute than it first appears. There is something even stranger in this pattern. Homo sapiens itself is changed by the process. The species that emerges as the sole surviving humanity is not genetically identical to the populations that first left Africa. As those populations move through Eurasia, they acquire ancestry from humans already living there. Later migrations mix these inherited fragments again. The eventual global population carries a complicated history of encounters embedded in its genome. The victory of one species, if it can be called that, is therefore partly a merger. Homo sapiens survives, but survival includes absorbing pieces of other humanities, and yet not every lost human leaves such a clear genetic legacy. Far from the continental corridors where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans repeatedly meet islands, create another kind of evolutionary laboratory. Their populations can remain separated for extraordinary periods, developing bodies that seem almost impossible when viewed through the expectation that all humans should gradually become more like us. On those islands, evolution follows its own paths, and the results become some of the strangest humans ever discovered. Across the water, the human story becomes stranger. Islands isolate populations in ways that mountains and deserts sometimes cannot. Once a small group crosses a deep channel and establishes itself on unfamiliar land, contact with the population it came from may become rare or disappear entirely. Generations pass without new genes arriving. Resources differ from those on the mainland. Predators may be absent, prey may be smaller, and the total amount of food available can be limited. Under these conditions, evolution can produce forms that would be unlikely within a large, continuously connected continental population. Few discoveries demonstrate this more dramatically than the small human bones found inside Liang Bua cave on the Indonesian island of Flores. When archaeologists uncover the partial skeleton known as LB1 in 2003, its anatomy immediately creates a problem. The individual is an adult, yet stands only a little over a meter tall. The skull contains a brain of roughly 400 cubic centimeters, far smaller than that of Homo sapiens and smaller even than expected for many early members of the genus Homo. At first, some researchers question whether the skeleton represents a modern human with a developmental disorder, but additional remains from other individuals together with detailed anatomical studies increasingly support a very different conclusion. Flores had been home to a distinct extinct human species, Homo floresiensis. Its small size quickly earns comparisons with fictional small people, but the nickname obscures the real scientific importance. Homo floresiensis is not simply a miniature modern human. Its body contains a mosaic of features. The skull is small, the feet are proportionally long, and aspects of the wrist, shoulder, pelvis, and lower limbs preserve characteristics unlike those typical of Homo sapiens. Some appear surprisingly ancient. The combination suggests a long evolutionary history separated from the one producing modern humans. How that history begins remains one of the major mysteries. One hypothesis proposes that the ancestors of Homo floresiensis descend from Homo erectus, or a related Asian population, and become smaller after reaching Flores. Island dwarfism is well documented in other mammals. Large-bodied species living with limited resources and reduced predation can evolve smaller bodies over many generations. Flores itself once supports dwarf stegodonts, extinct relatives of elephants, demonstrating that dramatic size reduction occurred in large mammals there. But another possibility is more radical. Some anatomical analyses suggest Homo floresiensis may retain features from an earlier smaller-bodied branch of Homo, potentially implying that its ancestors left Africa before or separately from the better-known expansion of Homo erectus. The fossil record needed to choose confidently between these possibilities does not yet exist. Scholars still debate the ancestry of the species, and new discoveries elsewhere in Southeast Asia could substantially change the picture. What is certain is that humans or human relatives reach Flores astonishingly early. Stone tools on the island indicate hominin presence long before the best-known Liangbua skeleton. Older hominin remains from Mata Menga also on Flores show that small-bodied humans are present there hundreds of thousands of years ago. Their teeth and jaw fragments suggest a possible relationship with later Homo floresiensis. This means the unusual evolutionary experiment on Flores is not a brief anomaly. It unfolds across an immense span of time. Reaching the island is itself remarkable. Even during periods of low sea level, Flores remains separated from western landmasses by water. The region east of the Sunda Shelf contains deep channels that do not simply become dry land during glacial periods. Some kind of water crossing is therefore required. Whether the earliest colonists travelled deliberately using simple watercraft or arrived through rare accidental events remains unresolved. A viable founding population requires more than one individual, however, making the crossing an enduring puzzle. Once isolated, these humans survive among animals unlike those familiar on the continents. Flores contains giant rats, Komodo dragons, and dwarf stegodonts. Archaeological evidence indicates that Homo floresiensis uses stone tools and processes animal resources. The small brain does not prevent effective adaptation to this environment. That fact alone undermines an old assumption that increasing brain size is an inevitable measure of evolutionary success. A similar surprise emerges farther north in the Philippines. In Calao Cave on Luzon, researchers recover teeth and bones belonging to another unusual human population. In 2019, these remains are formally described as Homo luzonensis. The fossils are fragmentary, but their combination of traits is distinctive. Some teeth have relatively modern-looking characteristics, while certain finger and toe bones resemble much older hominins in aspect of their shape. Again, geography deepens the mystery. Luzon has also remained separated by significant water barriers throughout the Quaternary. Earlier archaeological evidence indicates hominin activity on the island hundreds of thousands of years before the known Homo luzonensis fossils. But no complete sequence of fossils connects those early inhabitants with the later species. The evidence remains incomplete, leaving open fundamental questions about who first reached Luzon and how their descendants changed in isolation. Island evolution does not automatically produce small humans, and Flores and Luzon should not be treated as identical cases. Their environments, founding populations, and evolutionary histories may have been very different. What they share is isolation, and isolation allows unusual combinations of traits to persist or emerge without being continually blended into larger continental populations. The surrounding region may have contained still more diversity. Southeast Asia is geographically complex, with islands repeatedly changing size as sea levels rise and fall. During glacial periods, large parts of what are now Indonesia become connected to mainland Southeast Asia through Sunderland, but islands farther east remain separated by deep channels. These shifting coastlines create alternating corridors and barriers. Populations can expand across exposed plains, then become isolated when seas return. Unfortunately, tropical conditions are among the worst environments for preserving ancient DNA. Heat and moisture accelerate genetic decay. This means the molecular revolution that revealed Denisovans in cold Siberia cannot yet illuminate many tropical fossils with the same precision. Entire island lineages may therefore remain genetically invisible. Researchers must rely heavily on anatomy archaeology, geological dating, and occasionally ancient proteins. The disappearance of Homo floresiensis remains difficult to reconstruct. Revised dating places the youngest known skeletal remains earlier than some initial estimates, while stone artifacts associated with the species continue somewhat later. Modern humans appear in the wider region during the late Pleistocene, creating the possibility of eventual overlap or ecological interaction, but direct evidence of a meeting on Flores has not been established securely. Environmental change, volcanic activity, competition, demographic vulnerability, or combinations of factors could have contributed. No single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance. For Homo luzonensis, the ending is even less visible. The known fossil sample is too small to trace population decline. There is no final settlement showing a last community, and no genetic archive revealing whether these humans interbred with incoming populations. They simply emerge briefly in the archaeological record and then disappear from it. That silence is important. Flores and Luzon demonstrate how little evidence a long-lived human population can leave behind. Had Liangbua never been excavated, an entire species might still be unknown. Had a few teeth in Kalau Cave remained buried, another branch would be missing from every evolutionary diagram. The lesson extends far beyond these islands. If two unexpected human forms survived in a relatively small region of Southeast Asia, other isolated populations may once have existed elsewhere, without leaving recognizable remains. Some may be represented by fossils already sitting under uncertain labels, others may still be underground. Human evolution is therefore not merely more branched than once imagined. In some places it becomes almost experimental, producing small-bodied island humans, continental giants of genetic influence with barely any fossils and populations combining ancient and recent anatomical traits. The surviving evidence refuses to arrange itself into a clean progression, and beyond the islands waits an equally difficult collection of fossils, skulls, jaws and bones whose features resist familiar names, as though the human past is warning that even the species already discovered may represent only part of the diversity that once existed. Some fossils do not fit. They refuse the comfort of familiar labels and sit awkwardly between categories that once seemed clear. A skull may resemble Homo sapiens in one region and an archaic human in another. A jaw may appear unusually robust yet carry teeth with unexpected proportions. A face can look surprisingly modern, while the brain case remains ancient in shape. These combinations are not errors in the record. They are reminders that evolution works through populations, not through neatly separated boxes, and that the surviving fossil record captures only scattered moments from a much larger process. For much of the 20th century, paleoanthropologists often arranged human fossils into relatively tidy sequences. One species gave rise to another, which then gave rise to another, eventually leading to modern humans. The model was understandable because the fossil sample was small and evolutionary theory encouraged branching relationships. But as more remains were discovered across Africa, Europe, and Asia, the picture became increasingly difficult to simplify. Some fossils appeared too late to be straightforward ancestors. Others preserved combinations of traits that crossed expected boundaries. Genetic evidence later made the problem even harder by proving that populations once treated as separate branches could meet and exchange genes. One of the most debated groups of fossils comes from the Middle Pleistocene, roughly the vast span between earlier Homo erectus-like populations and later Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. Fossils from this period have often been placed into categories such as Homo heidelbergensis, but the name has been used in different ways. Some researchers restrict it largely to European material connected with Neanderthal ancestry. Others have historically applied it more broadly to fossils from Africa and elsewhere. The result is a taxonomic label that can conceal disagreement rather than resolve it. This problem is not merely about scientific naming. It reflects the deeper difficulty of reconstructing population history from incomplete anatomy. A fossil may preserve only part of a skull. Another site may produce a jaw without a face. Teeth survive unusually well, but teeth alone cannot reveal every relationship. Two populations can evolve similar features independently, while closely related groups can look different because they adapt to different environments. Without DNA, separating ancestry from resemblance becomes difficult. The situation in East Asia is particularly intriguing. Several ancient human skulls from China show combinations of traits that do not fit comfortably into a simple division between Homo erectus denisovans and modern humans. Some have been proposed as possible Denisovan relatives because their age and geography make the connection plausible. But without recoverable genetic material, most such assignments remain uncertain. The Denisovan genome tells scientists that a major archaic population lived somewhere across Asia. The fossil record contains many archaic humans from Asia. Connecting specific bones to that genetic population is the difficult part. The discovery of the Siahi mandible on the Tibetan plateau demonstrates how dramatically new methods can change interpretation. The jaw had no recoverable nuclear DNA suitable for the kind of analysis used at Denisova Cave, yet ancient proteins preserved in the teeth provided evidence of a Denisovan relationship. Before such techniques existed, the fossil might have remained an enigmatic archaic jaw indefinitely. The case suggests that other unidentified fossils may eventually find new positions as protein analysis and genetic methods improve. Another controversial fossil comes from Harbin in northeastern China. The large, remarkably preserved cranium has been proposed by some researchers as belonging to a species called Homo longi, sometimes popularly referred to as Dragon Man. Its relationships remain debated. Some analyses have suggested that the skull could be close to the lineage associated with Denisovans, while others caution that morphological comparisons alone cannot securely resolve the issue. The fossil is scientifically important precisely because it illustrates how unsettled the Asian record remains. Africa contains its own difficult fossils. Modern Homo sapiens does not appear suddenly with every recognizable modern feature present at once. Early fossils attributed to our species show mixtures of archaic and modern characteristics. The remains from Jebel Ehud in Morocco, dating to more than 300,000 years ago, possess faces that appear relatively modern in important respects, while their brain cases remain more elongated than those of people today. Other early Homo sapiens fossils from eastern and southern Africa display different combinations. This supports the idea that our own characteristic anatomy develops gradually within a network of populations rather than appearing fully formed in one location. Some African fossils have been assigned to separate species whose relationships to modern humans remain debated. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa, presents an especially striking mosaic. Its brain is small and parts of its skeleton preserve primitive-looking traits, while other features of the hands, feet, and lower limbs appear more derived. Dating places the known remains surprisingly late overlapping, in time with early Homo sapiens elsewhere in Africa. This means a small-brained human lineage survives far later than older evolutionary models might have predicted. Claims about complex behavior associated with Homo naledi, including possible intentional disposal or burial of bodies and engraved markings in the Rising Star cave system, have generated considerable debate. Some researchers interpret the evidence as suggesting unexpectedly sophisticated behavior, while others argue that stronger proof is required. The dispute illustrates an essential principle. Extraordinary implications should not be treated as settled simply because they make a compelling story. The evidence remains incomplete, and scientific disagreement is part of the process. Another enigmatic population is represented by Homo antecessor from Atapuerca in Spain. These fossils, dating to roughly 800,000 years ago, combine features that have been interpreted in different ways. Protein evidence has helped clarify that the population lies close to the ancestry shared by later Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans, but its exact position remains uncertain. It is not a simple missing link. Few real fossils are. The phrase missing link itself becomes increasingly misleading as the record improves. It implies that evolution is a chain with one absent connecting piece. Human evolution is closer to a branching and reconnecting network containing many populations, some ancestral, some side branches, and some connected by interbreeding. Finding one new fossil does not necessarily close a gap. It may reveal 3 new gaps around it. This complexity also makes the definition of species difficult. In living animals, reproductive isolation is often used as one important criterion, but extinct humans complicate that standard because Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens clearly exchange genes. If they are classified as separate species, then those species were not completely reproductively isolated. If they are treated as subspecies, or populations within a broader group, their anatomical and genetic differences can appear too substantial for some researchers. There is no universally agreed solution. The disagreement does not mean the science has failed. It means biological reality is more continuous than human categories. Taxonomic names are tools for organizing variation. Nature does not have to respect the borders those tools create. There is also a preservation bias hiding behind every debate. Some environments produce many fossils while others destroy bone rapidly. Caves are overrepresented because they protect remains. Open landscapes where millions of humans may once have lived can leave almost nothing. Coastal settlements are especially vulnerable because Pleistocene shorelines now lie underwater. Vast regions of Africa and Asia have been investigated far less intensively than Western Europe. The human family tree may therefore appear more European simply because European caves have been studied for longer and preserve material well. Future discoveries could overturn familiar assumptions with astonishing speed. One jaw containing escient proteins might connect a mysterious skull to Denisovans. One tropical cave with unusually good preservation could reveal a lineage no one has predicted. A fragment already sitting in a museum collection may contain diagnostic DNA, that earlier technology could not recover. Denisovans themselves prove that this possibility is not speculative fantasy. It has already happened. The most unsettling conclusion is that the known list of ancient humans may still be incomplete. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, Homo naledi, and other named groups may represent only the branches fortunate enough to leave recognizable evidence. Ghost populations hinted at by genetics suggest additional diversity beyond the fossils currently classified. Each strange skull therefore carries two stories. One is the story scientists can reconstruct from measurements, dates, chemistry, proteins, and genes. The other is the much larger story that has been lost, the population itself, its appearance in life, its movements, its social world, and the reasons it eventually disappeared. By the time the surviving evidence is assembled, one fact becomes unavoidable. The question is no longer whether humanity once had many forms. It did. The deeper mystery is why after millions of years of branching diversity only one of those forms remains recognizable on Earth today. The world eventually becomes strangely quiet. Not literally, because human voices spread farther than ever before, crossing continents, coastlines, deserts, forests, and islands. But in evolutionary terms, something extraordinary has happened. The other recognizable human forms are gone. No Neanderthal communities remain in European valleys. No known Denisovan population survives in the mountains or forests of Asia. The small humans of Flores disappear, and the people represented by the bones of Luzon vanish from the record. Other lineages had already ended earlier. After millions of years during which several forms of humanity could exist, at the same time Homo sapiens becomes the only surviving human species. That outcome can seem inevitable from the present because every person alive belongs to the same species. But nothing in deep prehistory guarantees it. Neanderthals survive for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing. Homo erectus and related populations persist across immense spans of time. Denisovan-related humans adapt to environments as difficult as the Tibetan Plateau. Island lineages survive long periods of isolation. Homo sapiens is not entering a world populated by evolutionary experiments that are obviously destined to fail. Many of these populations have already demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Why Homo sapiens survives when the others do not therefore requires more than one answer. Physical anatomy alone is insufficient. Modern humans are not the strongest human form. A robust Neanderthal probably possesses greater upper body strength than the average Homo sapiens. Brain size provides no simple explanation either. Neanderthal cranial capacities overlap with, and sometimes exceed those of modern humans. Nor can survival be reduced to one revolutionary invention appearing suddenly in our species. Archaeology increasingly shows that many behaviors once claimed as uniquely modern have deeper or more complicated histories. The advantage may instead lie in flexibility operating across many levels at once. Homo sapiens populations develop technologies suited to radically different environments. They exploit coastlines, rivers, grasslands, forests, deserts, cold steppe, and eventually Arctic landscapes. They cross water barriers. They maintain social contacts over substantial distances. Materials and ideas move between groups. Symbolic systems may help reinforce identities and relationships beyond immediate communities. None of these abilities needs to be completely unique to Homo sapiens for their combination to matter. Demography magnifies small differences. A population connected to many neighboring groups can recover after local disaster more easily than an isolated one. People can move between communities. Partners can be found beyond the immediate group. Knowledge lost in one place may survive somewhere else. A new tool or strategy can spread through a network rather than disappearing with the death of its inventor. Over thousands of years, cultural connectivity can become as important as physical adaptation. The ability to accumulate knowledge may be particularly significant. Human technology is not simply invented, it is inherited socially. Each generation receives information from the previous one and modifies it. When populations are large and connected enough, innovations can accumulate rather than repeatedly being lost. This process, often described as cumulative culture, eventually becomes one of the defining strengths of Homo sapiens. Exactly when it reaches its later intensity remains debated and extinct. Humans clearly possess cultural traditions of their own. The difference may be one of scale rather than an absolute cognitive boundary. Language almost certainly plays a central role in this process, though its evolutionary history remains frustratingly invisible. Spoken words do not fossilize. Neanderthal anatomy and genetics provide reasons to believe they possessed substantial vocal capacities, so language cannot simply be assigned to Homo sapiens and denied to everyone else. Yet even modest differences in linguistic complexity teaching storytelling, or the ability to maintain shared identities across larger networks, could have profound demographic consequences over time. There is another advantage that sounds almost contradictory. Homo sapiens survives partly because it does not remain biologically pure. As populations expand, they interbreed with other humans. Useful archaic variants enter the modern genome. Denisovan-related ancestry contributes to high-altitude adaptation. Neanderthal-derived variants influence immunity and other physiological traits. The expanding species does not merely replace local humans. In some regions, it incorporates parts of them. This capacity to absorb ancestry may have accelerated the disappearance of smaller populations. If Homo sapiens greatly outnumbers a local archaic group, repeated interbreeding can gradually dissolve the smaller population into the larger one. The independent lineage ends, but not all of its descendants do. Extinction becomes intertwined with assimilation. That makes the phrase last human species standing slightly deceptive. Homo sapiens stands alone taxonomically, but not ancestrally. The genome of the surviving species contains traces of encounters with vanished populations. Different living communities preserve different fragments, meaning the ancient human world has not been completely erased. It has been broken apart and distributed among descendants. Even the idea of a final extinction date becomes uncertain. Archaeology can estimate when recognizable Neanderthal sites cease appearing, but it cannot identify the moment when the final person with predominantly Neanderthal ancestry dies. Denisovans are harder still because their fossil record is so sparse. On islands, archaeological silence may reflect true extinction, migration, demographic collapse, or simply missing evidence. Scholars still debate many of these chronologies. What can be said with confidence is that human diversity narrows dramatically during the late Pleistocene. By the beginning of the Holocene, the world appears to contain only Homo sapiens. Soon afterward, some human societies begin adopting agriculture. Settlements expand. Populations grow enormously. Cities eventually appear, followed by states-writing systems and civilizations. The entire recorded history of humanity unfolds after the other known human forms have already disappeared. This creates a profound limitation on human imagination. Homo sapiens has no historical memory of sharing the world with another human species. Written traditions begin far too late. By the time people start recording kings' wars, harvests, taxes, gods, and journeys, Neanderthals have been gone for tens of thousands of years. Denisovans have disappeared into genetic inheritance. Floresiensis is buried beneath cave sediment. No story survives explaining who they thought they were. Their rediscovery therefore comes from objects that cannot speak: bones, teeth, stone flakes, sediment, proteins, and DNA. Each method recovers a different piece. Archaeology reconstructs behavior. Anatomy reveals bodies. Genetics reveals relationships and encounters. Geology rebuilds vanished landscapes. None can restore the entire human being, and perhaps that is why these extinct relatives remain so compelling. They are familiar enough to be recognized as human, and different enough to reveal that humanity could have taken other forms. Their existence breaks the illusion that Homo sapiens represents an inevitable destination toward which evolution was always moving. If circumstances had changed slightly, another lineage might have survived longer. A Neanderthal population might have endured in an isolated refuge. Denisovan-related humans might have remained somewhere in Asia. An island lineage might have survived until much more recently. Evolution offers no guarantee that the branch looking backward from the present was always destined to continue. Instead, survival emerges from contingency climate numbers, migration, cooperation, innovation, interbreeding, geography, and chance interacting across thousands of generations. Homo sapiens survives not because history crowns it in advance, but because its populations repeatedly pass through conditions that eliminate others. The strange humans that time erased are therefore not failed versions of us. They're evidence of alternative human histories. They show that intelligence, cooperation, technology, adaptation, and social life existed in more than one form. Their disappearance reduced a once diverse human world to a single surviving branch. Yet even that branch carries the others within it. In a fragment of inherited DNA in a cave floor holding molecular traces in a worn tooth, beneath ancient sediment the vanished world remains faintly present. The other humans are gone as peoples, but they have never become completely absent. And in that unfinished disappearance lies perhaps the strangest part of the entire story. The bones grow quieter as the distance increases. Tens of thousands of years separate the present from the last landscapes where several kinds of humans walked beneath the same changing sky. Forests have shifted, rivers have abandoned old channels. Ice sheets have melted, raising seas across plains where people once hunted and travelled. Caves that held firelight now hold sediment mineral deposits, and the patient darkness in which fragments wait to be found. Most will never be found. For every ancient person whose tooth reaches a laboratory, countless others disappear without leaving anything recognizable. Their footsteps are erased by rain. Their camps are scattered by rivers. Their wooden tools return to soil. Their names, if they had names in forms we might understand, vanish with the last people who remember them. And still the silence is not complete. A tiny bone can preserve a genome. A jaw can carry proteins that identify a lineage forgotten for 40,000 years. A living person can carry an adaptation inherited from humans whose faces remain unknown. The past does not survive evenly. It survives in fragments, and those fragments are sometimes enough to overturn an entire picture of who humans once were. The modern world contains only one humanity, and that can make the present feel permanent. Deep time suggests otherwise. For most of our evolutionary story, survival is uncertain, populations are fragile, landscapes change, and branches disappear. Homo sapiens is part of that same history, not outside it. Perhaps the vanished humans are most valuable for this reason. They widen the meaning of humanity while making its survival seem less inevitable. They remind us that a species can dominate a landscape and still disappear, that a population can vanish while leaving pieces of itself inside another, and that history can erase almost everything without erasing absolutely everything. Somewhere beneath a cave floor, inside an unexplored deposit or an old museum drawer, another fragment may still be waiting. Perhaps it belongs to a human already known. Perhaps it will reveal another branch entirely. Until then, the lost humans remain where deep time has left them, scattered through stone sediment and living DNA, faint traces of a world in which humanity was once many.